This is Roger Mudd in New York, continuing our special coverage of today's historic events in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and in Washington, D.C. You have just heard the President of the United States make an address that has been urged upon him over the past month by the Negro leadership in America and by the liberal leadership in America. The President described the rising Negro militancy constituting a moral crisis in the United States. He said this rising tide of discontent threatens the public safety of the United States. He says the fires of frustration and discontent are burning in every city in America. And he said that he will ask the Congress to act, to legislate next week. He says legislation must be forthcoming at this session, and unless Congress acts, the remedy, he said, for the Negroes will be found in the streets. He said that he will ask Congress to enact a law prohibiting discrimination in public facilities and hotels, restaurants, and retail stores. He will ask the federal government to have power to initiate suits for school desegregation, and will ask for greater protection on the right to vote. As part of our continuing coverage, we want to call in CBS News correspondent Dan Rather and CBS newsman Nelson Benton in Tuscaloosa, who are standing by for a description of today's events.
The situation here in Tuscaloosa and on the campus of the University of Alabama at the moment is as it has been most of the day, and that is extremely quiet. CBS newsman Nelson Benton is just back from a tour of the campus, and in particular the dormitory areas where the two Negro students are housed. Nelson, there's nothing to indicate that there is anything brewing at all on campus, is there?
That's right, Dan. The security very definitely in effect. Jimmy Hood is at Palmer Hall, and that edifice on the campus is hinged off from the rest of the campus by state patrolmen. Only students who live there are going through. The same situation exists at Mary Burke Hall, a new dormitory where Vivian Malone is staying. But so far there's no jeering. There are a few soldiers lolling around on the campus going about just being there, but that's just about what it is.
Nelson, don't you agree we'd be amiss if we didn't point out that it has been very, very quiet on campus and in Tuscaloosa for the last week, really, although these security measures have been in effect and are still in effect, that certainly the way the students behaved themselves today was a credit to the university, and the same thing can be said to the city of Tuscaloosa. I haven't seen even a hint of an incident of any kind.
I think that must be said. The strongest emotion that you could see out there today displayed by a student was perhaps curiosity.
And one point that needs to be made is that there was some question before today whether Governor George Wallace would leave the Alabama State Troopers on campus and or in the city of Tuscaloosa once federal forces were brought in to make sure that the Negroes got on campus. You'll recall at the University of Mississippi crisis last fall, when James Meredith was enrolled there, that the Mississippi State Troopers were withdrawn from the campus just after federal authorities moved on. That's the reason there was some question about whether the Alabama State Troopers would stay on. Governor Wallace has ordered them to stay on, as he put it, just as long as they are necessary to maintain peace and order, and the security of the campus and the city of Tuscaloosa is now, as it has been for the past week, completely in the hands of the Alabama law enforcement officers. This is Dan Rather with Nelson Benton in Tuscaloosa, Alabama.
Among the strongest Southern voices for moderation and obedience to the law is the Atlanta, Georgia Constitution, and the voice behind that paper is the Constitution's editor, Ralph McGill. He's waiting in Washington now with Charles Von Frem to discuss today's events in Tuscaloosa. Go ahead, Chuck.
Mr. McGill, as a moderate in the South when it comes to civil rights, you've also been described as the conscience of the South by a good many people. What were your thoughts this morning when a defiant governor stood in the doorway of the University of Alabama?
Well, I was ashamed. I understand that a circle had been painted for the governor. He stood in this small painted circle. I thought this was symbolic. There are now left two governors who stand in these small circles, Governor Barnett of Mississippi, Governor Wallace of Alabama. These circles have diminished. They're quite small now. It seemed to me, as a Southerner who has written and watched the Southern political scene for almost half a century now, that this was Governor Wallace revealed a typical bit of demagogic fakery which has been current in the Southern political scene for a long time. He said that he was a sovereign state, This is not true. He said he was acting under constitutional legality guaranteed by the 10th Amendment. This is not true. He said the federal government was interfering with public education. This is not true. The 6th article of the Constitution of the United States, adopted in 1789, clearly spells this out. I think every citizen might read this. Section 2 and 3 of Article 6. This governor, Governor Barnett, and all others have taken an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. This oath in Article 6 of the Constitution adopted in 1789 does away with the old sovereign states which existed in the Confederation which preceded the United States. There are no such rights guaranteed in the 10th Amendment. They are spelled out in Article 6, and they say that every legislature, every governor, every judicial officer, every state officer of any kind is bound by their oath to support the Constitution. These are the rights spelled out. There is no sovereign state. We are a federal union, and the Constitution has primacy because the Constitution had to be brought into being by Hamilton and others because the Confederation had fallen into near war. So this is a bit of fakery which Southerners have indulged in for years. It sounds good in oratory.
Mr. McGill, was Alabama the key? And now that the governor there has apparently failed in his efforts to keep his schools segregated, do you expect the rest of the South to also fall on this issue?
Well, I would think that it will take in Alabama because of the attitude of the governor and because of the attitude of Governor Barnett, who, despite their disclaimers of violence, and I think Governor Wallace certainly must be given some credit for not encouraging it, as was done in Alabama, in Mississippi, but I think that the possibilities of violence are not removed so long as the governor deceives these people by saying he's acting constitutionally and encourages them to believe that they're being put upon. The federal government is not interfering with education at Alabama. The university had accepted these two students. The federal government is not saying what they shall teach or what they shall pay the teachers or what they shall do. All it has done is saying they can't discriminate against a student, a qualified student. Now, why does the governor say that they're interfering with education? This isn't true, nor is any of the others. This is an old-time bit of fakery which demagogic politics has seen so long in the South.
Mr. McGill, in recent weeks and months, we've suddenly been aware of a new militancy, you might say, on the part of Negroes in the South. How is this going to affect their cause? Will it slow down their bid for integration, or might it speed it up?
Well, certainly it has some frightening aspects if we look ahead and if the Congress does not act as the President requested. But I don't think this is a new militancy. We have had the Freedom Riders, we've had the sit-in groups, and we've had the student boycotts for 3 years now. But certainly I'm sure that the terrific violences and the dogs loosed on people and the fire hoses in Birmingham, that this has made expanded this policy of seeking to have full rights. It's greatly expanded, but I wouldn't say it's new.
Do you see any hopeful or encouraging signs in the South these days? Is it all just as bad as we've been seeing and hearing in recent weeks?
No, it isn't. There are many signs. I think the Southern story really is one of getting ahead. Well, there are many small things. We haven't time, but at the University of Georgia, a fine young Negro senior was elected to Phi Beta Kappa by an all-white group. 3 ministers in Mississippi last Sunday announced they were going to ask to be moved. They could no longer endure this agony of having Negro worshipers turned away. The Clemson College could have given Governor Wallace an example. A young Negro entered there in January without any governor interfering. The students have accepted him. In many other states, all of the other states, really, there's a great deal of progress. And this is the shameful thing for Governor Wallace, mild relatively as he was compared to the Governor Barnett, to deceive his own people with this constitutional bunk and to say that the university is being interfered with in the conduct of its education.
Mr. McGill, as you pointed out, you've spent almost a half century in the South reporting on its ways, especially insofar as the civil rights story goes. You've been sitting here this evening with me watching the president's speech on television. What effect do you think his nationwide address will have on the people in the South?
Well, I can't help but believe it will have a good effect on everyone except the real extremist diehards. After all, this thing, as the president said, is pretty simple. Do we mean to say that in the southern part of the United States, a Negro citizen can't go in a restaurant, that he can't have a hotel room, that he can't go to a movie, that he can't send his children to school? Surely we don't really mean to say this. And yet here we have a governor inspiring a lot of people to think that they do have a right to do this and that this is the American way. I think the president's speech will have a good influence on every thoughtful person.
Some civil rights advocates have been complaining recently that there hasn't been enough leadership on the part of the federal government. Is this argument valid, do you think?
I don't think so, and I think this was brought out in what we've seen today. There is this federal and state government. And I thought it was a little shabby for the governor to speak of the central government. It's his government. To speak of it as if it were some foreign government. There is this dichotomy. There are some states' rights, not to discriminate, but there are states' rights. There are these two powers. And so I think that the president has been wise to try to work it out and ask it to be done locally. This is where it should be done.
But based on the recent past and the present experiences, is it possible, Mr. McGill, to look ahead to the future and come up with a timetable that might indicate when there will be an end to segregation in the South? Is it 2, 3, 5 years?
Not a timetable like one for a railroad or an airplane. But I would say this thing is worked out now largely in an urban complex and in the state universities. I would say 5 years, we ought to be well along in our big urban centers with here and there in rural areas some disaffection or some resistance. But in the main, we've got it made.
Thank you very much, Mr. McGill, for being with us. Now back to Roger Mudd in New York.
That was the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, Ralph McGill, in a conversation with CBS News Washington correspondent Charles von Fremd. Few of America's problems have the personal, emotional impact on the individual citizen that the race conflict does. It may be that the detachment of a foreign view is needed to help us see clearly. And the foreigner who has concerned himself most intimately with America's racial problem is Sweden's Gunnar Myrdal. His book, American Dilemma, has become an unexpected classic on the subject. Here is Paul Niven interviewing Gunnar Myrdal.
Do you think there's any likelihood that Negro leadership will pass from moderates to extremists?
I don't think so, because it's, on the one hand, it's natural that a racial group like the Negroes, who feel severely discriminated against and feel that they have not got their right. On the one hand, it's natural that then you will have movements of desperation. You have had it in old times. You had the Garvey movement. You had a fear here that Negroes should go communist. As you know, there are very few communist Negroes at any time. And now you have these Muslims and you have other radicals. The main body of Negro leaders and ordinary Negroes, however, see their great hope of being accepted as ordinary Americans.
Well, you're rather optimistic then. You feel that the struggle is going on much as it has without much more violence, but...
Well, you might have more violence as the movement is accelerating. Here again, I would like to, in the last chapter, I have a quotation from a friend of mine, whom I call at that time an eminent and conservative Negro sociologist. The man I referred to was the late Charles S. Johnson, who was the first Negro president of Fisk University. And he one evening said to me, you know, Gunnar, I'm not afraid of race riots and even lynching here and there. I would be more scared if nothing was happening, because then things might settle down. When unfortunate things might even spur the movement, create a consciousness among Americans what's happening. I think, for instance, if you want me to give a straight example, and I'm speaking straight to you, I'm accustomed to speak, I'm a squarehead, and I'm very much at home in America, that when you had the pictures, which I saw the last time when I visited America, of the dogs biting Negro kids, that awakened much good conscience in white America all over the country.
Some observers say that today in Tuscaloosa was the last great confrontation between state and federal power. that now that some degree of integration has come to every state, there can be no further occasions for anyone to stand in the door. But in reality, this is an argument that was settled 100 years ago at Appomattox. Then as now, it was probably inevitable that in the matter of the United States versus the governor of Alabama, the United States would prevail. This is Roger Mudd in New York. Good night.
The program regularly scheduled at this time was not broadcast in order to bring you a special address by the President of the United States and this CBS News special report. This is the CBS Television Network.